Brian, what's up? So great to see you. Glad you could join me.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Excited to get this conversation under on the roll.
Yeah, we have a good friend, a good mutual friend in Larry Hagner. And when Larry reaches out and says, "Hey man, you got to talk with this guy," I'm like, all right, I got to talk with this guy because he wouldn't speak as highly as he does of you if he didn't mean it. So I'm glad we could make it happen.
Yeah, I really enjoyed getting to know him and being on his podcast as well. Same thing when he referred somebody over, I was like, well, it's going to be a quality dude because he's a quality dude. So,
Yeah. We actually started at very similar times and on similar paths with what we're doing. And I'm excited to talk with you today because I've in being introduced to you, I went a little bit through your bio and through your history, and you're a rescue helicopter evacuation pilot, which is impressive as it is. But then I saw that you talk a lot about PTSD and overcoming these traumatic events and experiences that we have. And I think that's something that a lot of guys deal with. And for the most part, I think traditional advice is just to quote unquote man up, which I don't have a problem with that term if there's some context behind it. But just to get over it, I don't think is something that is good advice or works.
yeah, the only way out is through. You can't just bury. And so, yeah, I don't think just get over it without any context based around it is good advice.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on men who are dealing with some of these traumatic events in the past, whether that was something as a child that maybe they forgot a lot of over 30 years ago, or just something relatively recently in military combat, or maybe even just something uh, difficult and challenging that they're experiencing in their marriage or in their business? What thoughts do you have on that?
Yes, interesting. I never gave thought to trauma. I just didn't. It was not something I don't think I had a traumatic childhood. I don't think I had, I mean, there was things, but it just didn't really impact me too much. But then after going and deploying initially as an Apache pilot and then multiple deployments after as a combat search and rescue pilot, obviously interacting with what everybody would agree are traumatic events. And this is what I think is interesting. Everybody can agree certain things are traumatic, but there's a lot of things that are traumatic that are individual as fingerprints to the person, right? Some things that may be traumatic to one person are Wednesdays to another, right? And it's just there's so many different variables and factors in there. So rather than trauma compare, really what we got to do is trauma repair. And that's there's a preparation and a reparation, and some of the same skill sets do both. Through my book, I actually share, I use things that everybody agrees are traumatic, and then I compare them to like things that people may not think are as traumatic. Like, I actually, I think everybody would agree that blowing up people is a traumatic thing, right? But in many ways, my caustic relationship with a with my wife at the time was much more traumatic and much more impactful to me than what everybody else would look at and go, oh, of course that's traumatic, right? And a lot of it had to do with the preparation, preparation for a certain situation, vice zero preparation for the other. So I think that's a very real part of trauma is being prepared. I memean, when we get sideswiped with something we weren't prepared for, that's what leaves impact. If we're prepared for it, you lower your shoulder and it hits you, it doesn't hurt as much. But if you're not even expecting it, you get ear holed, if you use a football term,
Yeah.
holy crap, what happened?
Yeah. I
So
think
I
that's a
think
good
trauma,
point.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, you had a concept that I wasn't familiar with, and I'd like you to explain this concept of chair flying, because I think that speaks to what you're addressing is being prepared and aware of what traumatic experiences or events we might deal with. Therefore, we're more equipped to deal with them when they inevitably happen, and they will, right? Like
Of course.
we'll get divorced, we'll suffer a job loss, we'll deal with a medical condition, a loved one will die. Like these things are going to happen.
Right.
How do we begin to prepare for what will inevitably take place?
Yeah, chair flying is a term that we use in the aviation world that is more like just visualizing what you're going to do. But I adapted it to become more of a robust ritual, if you will, that I will go through. And it wasn't to prepare me for trauma, but it had that effect. And through the process of the deployment that I chronicled in the book with the Apache, when I got back, what I really noticed was we had different reactions to the same stimulus, meaning a lot of my brothers in arms did not deal well with with certain situations, and others maybe were the same. And then I feel like I actually grew from those situations. They weren't pretty situations, but I feel like they made me a stronger version of myself. And so I was like, how can we have such diverse responses to the same stimulus? Where they're all warriors. I mean, those guys are guys that I would stand shoulder to shoulder with
Of course.
again and again and again. So, but we had such different reactions. It wasn't like one guy was just weak and he didn't handle it. And there was dudes that I was like, man, that guy is freaking rock solid, and it broke him. Well, I use that term loosely. I don't believe anybody's broken, but it definitely caused them some damage, right? So, I got home and really started digging into trauma, digging into why and why. And a lot of the guys that are smarter than me that have three letters behind their names really dug in with me. And they're like, hey, well, here's some things you were doing, right? Well, one of the things was chair flying. And early on, they made me an aircraft commander on my deployment, which gave me an elevated level of responsibility, both in the aircraft and out. But on that, and then I felt like I wasn't maybe ready, but at the same time, ready or not, here you are. So I knew we were going to be in a lot of crazy situations because I'd already experienced a few as a co-pilot while we were deployed. I'm like, holy crap, now I'm the man in charge. I got to prepare myself somehow for, we get shot out of the air, we get an engine shot out. I got to be the guy on the control. I got to figure that, I got to save us. Right. And I didn't feel like I was like the man yet, so like, I'm like, okay, how can I do this? And so really, I just took chair flying to another level. And I would say, I always joke about it and say, my chair flying version is this: if meditation, visualization, and role play all got together and had a love child, that would be my chair flying. So what I do, well, maybe here's I'll share a story and then I'll tell you how it played into it.
Okay. Yeah.
So one story that kind of was like the end or the capstone of whatever you want to call it, my deployment. We were taking down the biggest city in the biggest Taliban stronghold in Afghanistan, hadn't been messed with for years. And we went in, it was like I want to say 26 aircraft assault. But before the assault goes in, the Apaches go in and clear the area, right? So we were the very, very first people into the nasty, nasty guy land, right? And went in there, did that thing, and then it was like 2 weeks of just. At first, it was actually not as crazy as we thought initially, but then it picked up, and the Taliban started like throwing everything they could. And then one particular day, we were going to engage with basically the ground guys were like, "Hey, we got bad guys in the trees shooting at us. We're trying to figure out exactly where they are before we actually get cleared hot." Cleared hot is a directive that means you've met all the criteria to minimize collateral and maximize ordnance effect, and you're cleared to pull triggers, right? So that's the cleared hot directive. And I picked that as the name of the book because cleared hot, meaning you're cleared hot on your life. Like you've met the criteria, you can move forward with purpose and intent on your life, right? It's there. And if not, let's line it up so you realize you have.
Sure.
So they cleared us hot. And as I rolled in, this was going to be an engagement inbound run. And as I started to turn inbound, my co-pilot started screaming, blood curling screams. He just taken around through his femur, shattered his femur, and we were falling out of the air. So him screaming, you'd think would be the number one priority, but he was number 3. At the same time, my engine was shot out. I have 2 engines, but 2 engines in this environment were required to maintain flight at the flight profile that I was in. So I had to change that flight profile in order to be more efficient to fly off of 1 engine. And
what do you mean by flight profile? Just I want to. What does that mean? Does that mean like the capability of the aircraft, or like, what is that?
You're more efficient at certain airspeeds. Like if you're at a hover, you're the least efficient. You need the most power to beat the air into submission, for lack of a better term. But like when you're got forward airspeed, you got more relative wind, all that kind of thing. It gets up real sciencey and geeky, and we can push our glasses back. But basically, you end up being more effective as an airframe in certain variables. Altitude, temperature, that all plays in there too. At certain altitudes and temperature, I can't fly the aircraft with 1 engine no matter what. It takes 2 to do any profile, right?
Interesting.
So luckily we weren't in one of those. Otherwise we would just crash. There was no option, right? So that happens. I lose an engine. I got to change the profile, but guess what? The flight controls are jammed as well. Don't know why at the time. So we're in an angle and we're slicing down. We call it your effective lift is reduced at certain angles. So we're actually falling. To increase the rotor speed, I need to slam the collective, which is the control in my left hand, which makes it go uppy downy, right? I need to actually slam it down, right? We're falling and you got to put it down. That's kind of counterintuitive. You want to pull up because you're falling, right? But by slamming it down, it increases flow through the rotor, spinning it with inertia, getting it enough momentum that we can get the rotor back to where we need. Because when he screamed in the background, there was rotor RPM low. That was a little audio, which means you're going to crash. This isn't really nice. You are going to
like, could you make that a
die.
little louder for me so I can focus on
And it's all
that?
calm too. Like you could hear him like in the video, you can hear him screaming and you hear the rotor RPM low, like ding,
Nice,
would you
soft,
like
soothing
peanuts?
voice for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I slam that down, and the cyclic is the control in my right hand. That's the one that's jammed. Unbeknownst to me at the time, his legs wrapped around it. That's why. It shattered, flipped it up, wrapped it around the cyclic. So it was locked in that position. I didn't know that though. In the Apache, you have the ability to break out of the controls. The mechanical linkage are designed to shear in cases such as this, right? And then you fly by wire, which is like driving your car without power steering, but you can still fly. All right. So I slammed that at the same time I slammed the other one down. And I remember thinking, like, Boeing advertises there's a 1 second easy on. I remember when they taught us that, I was like, who cares? What's the point? It takes 1 second to take effect, right? And now I know why, because if I would have taken effect, we were already in a bank and the correction would have actually probably snap rolled us with one engine. There's no way we would have recovered. We would have landed upside down, which is
Like an overcorrection essentially that quickly or something.
right. It would have been bad luck for the Apache upside down.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I remember thinking as I slammed it over, please work as advertised, right? And boom, came over, then brought the sit stick back to center, and it worked. It took a second, put it back to center, and we leveled out. We increased our airspeed by reducing our altitude, recovered. I don't know how many, I should have this memorized at 100 feet or something like that. We recovered out of there, and we started to come out.
That's how low you were to the ground. Is that what you said? 100 feet?
Oh yeah, well, or lower. I mean, we were at like 260.
Whoa.
I think we were at 260 when it happened. I mean, take all the time you need. You got half a second to do this, right?
That's
So,
all you got.
right,
Yeah.
you don't have time. There's no time. We're not falling from sky. I mean, we're literally below the cliff that the guys were calling us. The infantry was calling us to engage at a riverbed. So we were below the cliff line that they were calling out. Yeah, and then we flew down in the riverbed. And honestly, I think we recovered at around 100 feet, but that's because the terrain actually fell away a little bit too. Otherwise, it would have been like 40 or 50 feet, right? So why do I tell that story? Is because obviously we just hit it. How many of those things happened and had to happen? It took me 50 times longer to explain it than what we had to deal with it. It's like probably really realistically 1 to 3 seconds. You had to do all those things, right? And if I had to actually think through those things and like, oh, this is happening, now I got to do this, and oh, that's happening, I have to do this, and we wouldn't have made it. I wouldn't have had the time. I'm not smart enough, and maybe some people are, but I'm not. The reason I was able to do it was because of chair flying. Earlier on in my deployment, I started working myself through all these crazy scenarios, right? And I would get to a point, I would meditate, get myself to a place, I call it fertilizing your garden. Get yourself to a place that whatever you're about to plant in your head sticks, right? And so for me, meditation was just breathing exercises. I mean, other people use yoga, other people use whatever you use. Some people use weed. I don't know if that works or not, but I haven't tried it. But I would use breathing exercises, and I get calm, and I get into an environment that I knew I was control, right? And then I would start to imagine a scenario that I'm not sure how I'd get out of. Right. And I'd start to go down that road. And once I get to what I call a choke point where I have to make a decision, I would make the decision, then continue, and then I'd start over. And then I'd get to that, and until it wasn't a choke point anymore. It was just a smooth way through. And then I get to the next choke point, and I do the same thing, then start over. And until you do it over and over and over again, what you're doing is really teaching your brain, you're wiring it, the synapses of how you're going to react to these situations. And you get to where you go from start to finish with no choke points. Right. And then you start to then you actually do the role play. I'm actually talking through out loud. I'm moving my arms, I'm moving my legs, I'm doing the types of things. And that's muscle memory. You're starting to connect to what your brain's already wired, and it's just making it more familiar. Then I would give myself variables. What if it doesn't work like it's supposed to? Then what do I do? There's another choke point. There's another, and I would do this for like a half hour to an hour every night, just different things. And did I ever do a scenario where my co-pilot's front legs get shattered, I lose an engine, and the flight controls are jammed, and we're slicing out of the air, and we're about this far from the bad guys, and they're right up here? No, I didn't do that exact scenario, but I did so many that were like, yeah, did I do one with my engine get shot? Yes. Did I do one with my co-pilot get shot? Yes. Did I do one with my flight controls getting jammed? Yes. Did I do combinations similar to? Yes. So my brain already had all those routes. And when it was time, it merged the ones that it needed to. And I didn't have to really think through it. It just happened, right? That was the intent that I did chair flying for. But what I didn't realize the added benefit was, it's also stress inoculation, right? So a smart guy, medical guy, talked to me about this. He's like, yeah, you're preparing your mind for a stressful situation. You've already inoculated yourself, just like if it were a weakened virus and then the actual virus comes, you can beat your chest and say, go away, not today, right? I've already dealt with you in a weakened state. Now I can deal with you how you are. You're not going to knock me off my feet. It's the same thing with these types of scenarios. Like I pictured blowing people up before I blew people up. Didn't look exactly the same, but I'd already prepared my mind somewhat with how I would deal with that, what my frame of mind would be, how I would sleep that night. I even went to, when I was like chair flying, I would even talk about, I'm going to take a deep breath, which I did in that event. I remember go, and then, but I mean, it was a quick one. I didn't have much time, but and
Sure.
then there's the video. I don't know if you had the chance to listen to the video. It was in that media kit,
Yeah, I haven't seen
but
it.
yeah. So in the video, my voice is calmer than I am right now. Right. It's just like, hey guys, I just lost an engine, my co-pilot shot. My heart rate was probably playing Flight of the Bumblebee, but I'd rehearsed in these scenarios, stay calm, aviate, navigate, and communicate. That's what you're going to do, right? You're going to, in that order. And so it worked. I was calm. I did come across as, hey, this is a Wednesday, but it wasn't, it was
No,
inside.
I never had a Wednesday like that.
Yeah, I don't even know if it was Wednesday. It was December 7th though. I remember that. But it was preparing my mind for that physical act was what I was doing, but I didn't realize that it was actually protecting my mind from the traumatic event itself. Right. And so we can kind of do that in our daily lives. Like in the book, I mentioned bad relationship. I wasn't doing that with that at first. Like I was just reacting. Oh, it hit me, it hit me, it hit me, it hit me. And I hadn't chair flown anything. And I started chair flying conversations and hitting choke points. Well, if I say this will probably happen, right? So that rather than say that, I'll say this, or walking myself through it. Or if it does happen, how am I going to digest that? What is my reaction going to be? How am I going to de-escalate this situation? Or some situations you're like, it's not going to de-escalate. I'm going to be prepared to take it and just let it run its course. Whatever the case may be, we all know those scenarios. We've all dealt with those type of things. But if our mind's prepared for it, then our mind doesn't jump to these devastating places like, oh, that must mean that it's all over and this is it. It's not worth it. And all these kind of things. Like our mind's already prepared. We're like, okay, we know that this was a possibility. You already walked through how you're going to react. And it's not the end of the world. No matter what the results are, it's not the end of the world. Right.
Or the other thing is you don't make a bad problem worse. I'm thinking of that scenario with a relationship where maybe your spouse or your partner says something to you and we know how to dig at each other, right? We know each other well enough. Like, what points to press when you want to get at somebody. And
Nailed
so
it.
she says something to you that triggers you, and then you're triggered, and without thinking, you say something that gets at her, and then it just turns into this nasty spiral. Same thing with your scenario, I imagine. You triage the situation. You had priorities that you needed to deal with. If you would have dealt with your pilot, well, great, you dealt with him, you got the bleeding stop, but you crashed into the ground. You made a bad problem worse because you focused on the wrong priority in the wrong order.
Right. Yeah. And knowing the end from the beginning too, like walking the worst case scenario all the way to the end, not dwelling on worst case scenario. Don't get me wrong there, but walking it through the end and being like, yeah, at the end, I'm still okay. I'm still alive. I'm still, then you really get your attitude of gratitude. What are the benefits? What do you still have if you walk it through the end? And there's always a list if you're grateful, right? There's always a
Yeah.
list. And that helps you on the path through, because you realize no matter what turn this takes, I'll be okay. I have turns that I want it to take. I would prefer that it takes this turn. I don't prefer it takes that turn. But guess what? We don't always get what we want, right? But even if it takes these turns that I don't want, I've walked the dog through there, and I'm still me at the end, and I'm still grateful to have my son. I'm still grateful that the sun comes up every day. I'm still grateful that I have a job. I'm still grateful, whatever the case may be, the attitude of gratitude is huge.
I think where a lot of men struggle, and I do too, admittedly, is you're talking about a combat environment. You're talking about a situation that has obviously a heightened level of risk associated with it than the average person. So most of us live our lives assuming that we're not going to get in that car accident. We're not going to go through that divorce. Bankruptcy isn't going to happen to me. I'm not going to get diagnosed with cancer. Like, we believe that none of that stuff is going to happen in your environment, in the situation you're talking about. That's a very real possibility. How do
Yeah.
you address and work with these guys who have the mentality of, things are going to be fine and let's not catastrophize everything and just live our lives and hopefully it all works out?
I'll be honest. I think a lot of guys, and at least the way when I came through the military, a lot of that filtering process happens to where you get the right personalities there to begin with, right?
Sure.
I mean, they at least feel they're the right personality. They're not on the surface freaking out. They're not. Now, does that mean that the things that are happening and they're experiencing do not have impact? Absolutely not. Like I said, I mean, I've had friends that have actually taken their own life because of these things, right? And the analogy that I touched on a little bit, that the gratitude piece is a big piece of it. And that's what I'll try to teach guys is gratitude and perspective. When I first got to Afghanistan, I share this story often, but when I first got to Afghanistan, I was literally the first guy on boots on ground because I was advanced party for our company. Nobody in our company had ever deployed before on this first deployment. So I don't really have anybody like saying, this is what to expect. This is what you do this. And
Right.
and I didn't know either. So we landed early in the morning in Bagram Air Force Base. And I was in the back of the C-17 with our Apache helicopters, and the gate, things starts going down and light comes in. It's right out of a movie. You can't see, your eyes are dark adapted. And
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what I was expecting, but I mean, I was shocked that it didn't stink. It smelled good. It was refreshing. I was like, wait, we're in a war place. This should be like, I don't know, hot garbage or something. And then it continued down, and I saw snow-capped mountains that were beautiful and reminded me of the Rockies. And I'm like, it just threw me. I was like, there's beauty here, because I mean, duh, but it's kind of like, well,
Yeah,
of course
I get it.
there can be, but I didn't expect it. So when we're flying over those mountains, I'm looking at it, same thing. I'm like, holy crap, I would love to snowboard right there if there wasn't a mine, and all these other type of scenarios, but there's such beauty. And then, we'd get called into troops in contact, ticks, and you'd get pulled out of that beauty and right into the ugly, right? And the guy on the other end of the radio is breathing hard, and you can hear gunfire in the background, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, we need immediate suppression at this. You can tell there's urgency and direness in what he's saying. And we're sucked right in too. We're like, yes, we got you. We see you. We're going to go with, and we'll deal with that. And then the fire comes at us, now we're seeing that. And we're very, very front sight focused, right? We're very focused on the gunfight. And that's the world at that moment. That is our world. That's his world. In life, we often mistake the gunfight for the mountains, right? We're in the middle of a gunfight, and we think that that's the big picture, because in the middle of that gunfight, those mountains never went anywhere. That beauty never changed. That beauty is permanent. It is the infinite, where the gunfight is the finite, right? But often we flip the finite for the infinite and give it that definition, And that's what creates hopelessness, right? And so, we get out of that gunfight. The mountains are still there. And if you go up even higher, you can start to see the curvature of the earth. And I always say this, I don't care if you're over the ugliest place on planet Earth. If you're that high, it's majestic and beautiful, right? It's just amazing. I've never been to space, but I imagine in space looking at a planet that's blue and landmass, and it's just awesome. But the cool part about that is when you're at the curvature of the earth, it's beautiful in every direction. When you're in space, there is no direction. So it truly is the infinite. Beauty just is. It just is. It doesn't go anywhere. But on that planet that you're experiencing the beauty in that moment, how many gunfights are happening in that very moment? How many gunfights are happening when we're having this podcast? I hate to say it, somebody's getting killed right now somewhere,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's happening. That's reality. But those are gunfights. The attitude of gratitude, the perspective we need to maintain is that the mountains don't go anywhere, right? They're there. And we all have our mountains. With my son, I tell him, let's identify your mountains. And he has to list out what his mountains are. And I'm telling you, one of the biggest things and one of the biggest thrills to hear was, you are, Dad. You're one of my mountains, right? So that's one that gets me, And so it's important to identify our mountains, and it's important to be mountains for people, right? It's important to be that mountain for someone. So
Yeah, I like this idea. This is the way you said it is a new concept to me. I was thinking as you were talking about it, I saw this a lot when I was a financial advisor. We'd be working people through the stock market and teaching them how to invest successfully over a long time frame. And I got into the business around 2008, 2009, where it was the worst possible time that you probably could have got into financial services. And I
yeah,
saw people, flipping out, losing a lot of money, 30, 40% of $1 million portfolio at 63 years old is a scary proposition. I understand. But if we were to scan back and not look at that little blip, we were to scan back 10 years, 20 years, 80 years, you can't even barely notice that little blip on the map. And what we do, and I think this is your point, is that we make decisions based on the blip rather than scanning back, zooming back, and realizing, hey, this is a temporary moment. Let's address it. Let's deal with it the way we need to, but let's maintain a long-term perspective because life will get better. It definitely
yeah,
will get better.
yeah. And your attitude affects that, how quickly it will get better, right?
Good point.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, some people we've all met the Eeyores in our lives, right? Yeah, that everything's bad. It doesn't matter. They could get you could give them $1 million and be like, well, there's probably bacteria on that. You
How come
know,
it's not 2 million? Yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
that's somebody else got more than this. I mean, but we've also met the people that everything is positive, right? And so while that may be annoying sometimes, because the only reason it's annoying is because we don't have that ability, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Wouldn't
yeah,
it be nice?
yes, but like that's the thing is like, I mean, perspective is real. It creates your reality. Perspective.
You had said that I can't remember exactly, but you had said you talked with some individuals or some people with some three letters behind their name about some things that you and others were doing when it comes to how well you adapted to challenging situations relative to where other men may have struggled.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that there were things that you were doing, or they acknowledged things that you were doing. So chair flying was one of them. Were there other things that you recognized or that they recognized that you had done habitually that helped you get through these challenging and difficult times?
Yeah, there was a bunch, and in some of them I could teach, but some of them, like for example, some of them you can't teach. Like I can't control, what your living environment, if you grew up in a nuclear family or not, those kind of things. So,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
which I did, which helps, that helps. But there we identified 7 that you could teach. Chair flying was one of them. The other when it was we talked about her healthy perspective too, how to foster a healthy perspective. That was one of them too. Valuing a higher cause was one. Build healthy support systems. Avoid festering emotional wounds. Release hate. I never hated the enemy we fought, and I think that was a huge part of not making the knife cut both ways, right?
How did you
I
do
always
that?
say,
Because you probably saw those enemies kill your brothers in arms, and that's you could obviously take that very differently.
well,
How did you keep from hate?
one, I feel like I had a healthy respect for them. Um, anybody who's been to war knows that war sucks, right? Well, when we go to war, one, the wars I was in, we had a technical advantage to almost anybody we're fighting, right? A
Mm-hmm.
tactical and
Sure.
technical. We didn't even fully exploit our advantages because of rules of war. And, I mean, we could have got rid of that whole freaking country, just boom. But that's not what we're supposed to, that's just not who we are.
Right.
So I look at it from their perspective, and I think that's a big part of not hating your enemy is looking at it through their eyes as best you can. You'll never nail it, but you can try to do it. So empathy being a big part of that is, look, they've been fighting since freaking 812 or whatever the year was. Like there's no one in front of that, right? It's like they've been fighting their whole life. They don't know anything else. They don't get a
Mm-hmm.
mid tour. They don't have chow hall. They don't have these other things. And yet they're so convicted to their cause, which I don't agree with, obviously, because that's why we're there. They're so convicted that they'll live through those things and fight and go against a machine that can unleash devastation with a second with a rudimentary rifle. They'll go against that. They're either crazy or just very convicted, impressive individuals, right? Like, and I think there's probably a little bit of both. Some of them were crazy, but I have to respect that as a warrior to warrior. I'm like, holy crap, man! If I had all those notes, I'm going to live in this country. I'm going to stay here, and war will be my life. And I'm going to go up against an enemy that is way better prepared to do this than me. Would I have the conviction that they do? You know, and I don't know. I don't know, but I can respect that. I can respect that from their side. Now, I also know that I disagree with their side. So that's why there's a war, and that's why death has to happen in that scenario, right? And I always say, you're going to have to operate in the ugly sometimes. When you raise your hand and say, I'll do this for the country, or raise your hand and say, I'll do this for this, or I'll do that for that, you know that you're going to have to operate in the ugly. The trick is not letting that ugly operate in you, right?
Mm. Yeah, well, let's talk about that. How did it, the first time you ever deployed on a mission or had a mission where you knew you were going to be taking innocent life? Not, I shouldn't say innocent because I guess potentially it could have been, but you're fighting against an enemy. Um, how did you
Well,
cope with that? How did you deal with that?
the first time was I didn't know until I pulled the trigger, right? So my very first engagement, I wasn't even an aircraft commander yet. I was in the upgrade program, if you will. And we rolled around the corner and there was a convoy that had been ambushed and they were taking fire from multiple positions, but it was in the daytime. It was really hard to locate the enemy because they're just hide in trees and and there's not muzzle flashes to really go off of. You can see muzzle flash in the daytime, but it's not nearly as easy as at night. And this is
Right.
my first engagement, so I don't even really know what I'm looking for. And so we're trying to figure it out. And my aircraft commander was much more experienced than me. And he was aggressive, man. He was getting in there. We're like 10, 15 feet, 20 feet, banking around,
Oh,
looking for these guys. Like we're literally blowing up trees with the wind and seeing if there's people underneath, that kind of thing. And
jeez.
it was nuts. And in this scenario, the convoy was on one side of basically a canyon, and where they thought they were taking fire was on the other side. There was probably 200, 300 meters in between. And we were up on this shelf and they were on that shelf. And then we came out over the shelf to where we are actually over the canyon. So we went from like 20 to 30, maybe 50 feet to 300 feet. And
Mm-hmm.
right then we got rocked. We had this explosion, boom, lifted the aircraft up, pitched it forward. And I could see the rock we were going to crash on. I was like, that's where we end. That's it. That's my first engagement. We lose. This sucks because we're falling. and I'm not on the controls. So, we're falling, and I'm like, okay, if I live, I'm gonna grab my radio, my gun, I'm gonna get out my coat, my aircraft. I'm already thinking that stuff because we're falling,
Right.
right? And then all of a sudden we start flying. And I'm like, what? What happened? It's a miracle, And so what happened is an RPG blew up right underneath us and airburst or hit the rock wall. I don't know, but it created a bad dirty air, right? To where the blades of the helicopter weren't catching, just weren't biting, is what we call it. So we
Hmm.
fell through that dirty air. Once we got into clean air, we flew again, right? So I was like, holy crap. So that just happened. So we get back up and we're looking around, and then I start to see these little glints out of my corner of my eye. And I'm like, that's probably muzzle flash. That's probably muzzle flash. So I call the guys on the ground. I'm like, hey, confirm you have nobody in this area. There's like absolutely nobody there. So I told I see muzzle flash. He's like, then shoot it. Right. And I'm like, so I started shooting it with a 30 millimeter. And it's the first time in my life where when I squoze that trigger, life went away.
Right.
Right. Life just ceased to exist at the squeeze of that trigger. I'd shot targets. I was actually pretty close to our top gun in our competition. I was number 2, but I'd done well with targets. But now you're ensuring damnation, or whatever you want to call it. You're squeezing the trigger, and life goes away. So in the moment, I don't know if it had the impact that it did that when I got out of the aircraft that evening and my feet
Mhm.
were on the ground, and I was like, that just happened. They actively tried to kill us. We killed them. And now it's Thursday. Right. So it was kind of eye-opening. And by the way, same thing happened again in that same engagement. We were in the same area again, doing the same thing. So we know the definition of that, right? Expecting a different result. And we got rocked again. This time, rocks hit the canopy, and we were falling sideways this time. But I had 10-minute-old knowledge, looked at the system, saw our engines were good, and we flew out again. This time we figured out where the RPG shooter was at and delivered justice to him. And then, at the end of the day, that convoy was able to get out of there. So there's a good side of that. Hey, our guys are alive because of this. And then there's the other side of it. And so, yeah, that carried some weight. And I think the full weight didn't really manifest for years, because that was one of many, many engagements. And so at time they start to stack. And one thing that you said in just before, innocent lives. Okay. That happens. Innocent
Sure.
lives happen. Apaches, we do our best to minimize collateral damage, but these people fight with their families,
Mhm.
right? I'd be a fool to say I never killed a kid. I guarantee that happened, right? And when I started flying search and rescue, we're picking up casualties. We don't only pick up our casualties, we pick up enemy casualties, we pick up civilian casualties, and we pick up children casualties. And sometimes those children had shrapnel from Apaches,
Mm.
right? And so full circle. And that's where you have to acknowledge, you raise your hand. I will operate in the ugly, but I can't let that ugly operate in me. Otherwise, I won't make it. Right. And if I don't make it, if I don't choose me, I can't help others.
That's powerful. I think that's a man's job. I like that term, operating the ugly. I think that's a man's job. It's not always fairy tales and rainbows and sunshine. Like there's hard things that we need to do that we'll probably question for a lot of our lives. Maybe, and I'm not trying to compare, but maybe in your situation more so than mine or somebody else who might be listening. But well, that's our job. That's the weight. That's the burden of being a man and masculinity, I think.
It is, but how many men operate in the ugly and let that ugly operate in them?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it kills them. Whether
Well,
it
you
kills
said,
them,
go ahead.
whether it kills them because they get so overwhelmed with it that they see they're stuck in the gunfight and they see no way out and they take their own life, or it kills them slowly because they're letting the ugly operate in them. They're coping with it with alcohol, or they're coping with other self-harm type coping mechanisms. So they're killing themselves slowly, right? Or they're just letting it eat on the inside, and the stress and all that stuff is compromising health and everything else. So yeah, I mean, I think that is the challenge we have as men, is as we need to raise our hand and say, I'll operate in the ugly, because that's what we should do. But we have to do that knowing that we can't let it operate in us, because if it kills you, you can't help anybody else.
Yeah.
You can't help anybody else if it's eating you up. How many, I'm just going to throw this out there, and it might hit home with some people that are listening. How many times do we deal with the ugly, bring the ugly inside of us, and now we are harm to the people around us because
Yes.
we're not who we should be.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that's something I've dealt with, and even over the past year, 2 years, is you start to become something different, that isn't an asset but a liability, and
Yeah.
you wake up to that realization, man. It's a hard realization to
You're like, holy shit, I
come
didn't want
to.
to hurt anybody, but I
Right,
am.
right, yeah.
You
One of
know.
the things that you talk about that I think would help guys with this is, you said moving forward with intent and purpose. I'd be curious about your transition out of the military, because I know there are a lot of people who struggle when they transition because they had intent, they had purpose, they had direction and clarity and a mission, and then all of a sudden it's gone, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, it's gone. And they really
Mhm.
struggle because of that. But people deal with it in relationships. Maybe they prided themselves on being a husband, and they're no longer, or they had a job or a business that went under, and they self destruct because they wrapped up their identity in external
Mhm.
circumstances that are now no longer present.
Yeah, that's one of the principles. One of the seven. I don't know if I read it because I started to read through and we went on so. But one of the principles is define your honorable mission, right? Uh, I think it's important as individuals, as human beings, but especially as men, to have an honorable mission, to have a purpose, right? We see what happens when we tie ourselves to that purpose, as this defines me. That's dangerous. But to have a purpose and understand that you're there as a facilitator, and if that purpose goes away, you can define another honorable purpose. You can define another honorable mission. In combat search and rescue, our credo is that others may live. Tommel, maybe you've heard that, but that others may live. And the implied task is that, I mean, the implied task there is that you're willing to sacrifice your life that others may live. That's the implied task on that. Well, yeah, that's all well and good when you're downrange and in a combat situation, and we get so tied up in that creates our own persona, that's who we are, and, and we sacrifice ourselves everywhere, right? To where we don't even live. We don't choose ourselves first, like we just talked about. You got to choose yourself so you can help others. You got to put on the mask in the airplane before you can put it on somebody else, right?
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
have to do that, right? And so for me, I'm winding down my military career. I'm still active duty, but I'm on I call my retirement glide slope. Um, yeah, and I've already, the book was step one. This trauma over triumph, triumph over trauma is a nonprofit that we've put up that it does workshops to teach people how to take their obstacles and make them foundational rather than a weight around their neck, right? Make them a foundation of the best versions of themselves. Um, and so that has now become my honorable mission. Now, what happens if that goes away? I'll find something else. That's not who I am. It's just what I'm engaged in. It's just something that gives me a purpose. If that goes away, I'll find something else, but understand that there's infinite honorable missions. You aren't your honorable mission. Your honorable mission is something you work with because you enjoy it, right? If you're a military man and you're not a military man anymore, you're still you. Define your next honorable mission. I may be to raise your family. It may be, look, I have enough retirement. We're going to travel. That's my honorable mission. We're going to experience the world. That's your honorable mission. And then you get tired of that. Pick another honorable mission. You got to have it on the horizon. You got to have it in front of you. You got to have it defined. And as you do that, then your purpose is always there, right? You always have something that's not who you are, but keeps you moving as you are.
Yeah, and I think also what's valuable in that is, well, here's what I hear from a lot of guys is, oh, I don't know what that is. Like, I don't know what my mission is. I don't know what my purpose is. and they talk as if almost one day they're going to wake up and something miraculous is going to happen in their life where they'll just stumble over what they're meant to do. And I haven't found that to be the case. If anybody has, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I think you have to step into something that you're interested in. And only then do you get to see the next step.
Mm-hmm.
Like you aren't entitled to your purpose or your mission if you're not even willing to take one step towards something that even remotely interests you.
Yeah. No, you're right. There is no there. You are not owed anything by the universe, but you can experience the whole universe, right? It's just a matter of where you want to dip your toe. Dip your toe and move forward. See what that gets you. You know, if you're not connected to it, go somewhere else.
Yeah.
You know,
I
but you
want to
do have
shift
to put
gears.
effort.
You do, yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's not going to just happen. And you know what? Even if it did, let's just say there was some serendipitous event that happened to you.
Which I guess does happen sometimes.
It does, you win the
Yeah.
lottery or, whatever. I don't know what that doesn't relate to purpose necessarily, but it's a windfall. We'll take it.
Yeah, I'd take it.
Uh, but if you're not actively working towards it, you won't even acknowledge it. You won't even recognize it. It could hit you across the face and you wouldn't even see it because you're not willing to do anything about it.
You're not ready to receive.
Yeah, ready to receive. That's a good way to say it. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about. I think one of these topics that I had seen that stood out to me is these festering emotional wounds, because this is an area that I think a lot of guys have emotional trauma and wounds and injuries and scars that they've built up over time, and we just push that stuff down. Like, I don't want to deal with that, leave it alone. And it always comes back around, and it usually comes back around in destructive behavior. And then we don't acknowledge the destructive behavior until it destroys, and we acknowledge the destruction that it left.
100%. Yeah. No, and if we just apply logic, and men are generally logical, right? So let's just look at logic. If you
Sure.
cut your arm and you get it nastiness in it, and you just cover that up, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. You may lose your whole arm, and you may lose your whole body. I never really actually used this before, but I got a cut. I got a cut in Iraq in the gym on my thumb from a dumbbell, right? Just a little cut, right? And I was like, I didn't treat it. I didn't wash it. I did, it was little. It was a little one. I may have washed my hands or whatever, but I didn't really go do anything for that cut. About 5 hours later, my thumb is swollen, gigantic. My hand is red, and I'm like, it is just throbbing. I'm like, what the heck? And so then I go to treat it, and they're like, okay, yeah, you got a pretty nasty infection. I was like, this literally happened like 5 or 6 hours ago, right? Like, what the heck? And so they gave me a penicillin shot in my butt, right? Well, it wasn't enough. It's the next thing they said, 6 hours, give it 6 hours. We'll come back, see where we're at. I had that. I was in the dark and sleeping, trying to sleep, and my hand's just throbbing. Unbeknownst to me, it's actually growing and just swelling up. And I turned on the light because after like 2 or 3 hours, I was like, I can't. This thing is killing me. And it's like a baseball mitt. And now I have red lines coming up my arm, right? And I remember somebody saying, for infections, if you ever see red lines, you get to the hospital now, right? And so we went right to the hospital, and they're like, oh yeah, this is bad. So they put me on IV.
Red lines, like what? Like what? Describe that.
So they're just like, it's just red coloration going up your arm. Like they look like lines of red
Really?
coming up your arm, right? It's not external, it's internal, right? But it's like, I guess it's a sign of like really, 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 really bad infection growing fast and rapidly, right?
Yeah. Wow.
So my hand's huge. Anyway, they quarantined me. It's some sort of MRSA they've never seen before. All this kind of stuff. I got like, they were going to catheter my heart. It was getting that bad. And I had to go through several surgeries. I go through several surgeries. And
you got a visitor?
Yeah, it was my son.
I know that off-screen hand gesture and like, hey, I know that because I've done that two
Yeah,
dozen times, so I
I
know
actually think he just came in on purpose to ask if he could go play, knowing I would do this, and
it.
now he just got permission to play in his mind. He can use that little sucker. I think that's what he just did.
That's
Anyway,
funny.
but so they did the surgeries and all that. And long story short, I'm still here. It didn't kill me, but they told me, they said if you wouldn't have been healthy, or you would have been old, that would have killed you. And that was a
Whoa.
cut. That was a cut this big, right? That I just didn't deal with. Right. I could have went when I had that cut and scrubbed it out like this with soap and whatever, and I probably would have been fine. Nothing would have happened. Right. But how many times do we have like, oh, that's no big deal. I'll just push that down. I'll just push that down. I'll
Yeah.
push this down. You know, well, we start stacking that crap and then start holding it inside. And I don't know if it's a learned behavior or a nurture nature that I I I know I did it, you know, and really, this is what I tell people. You got to get to where if it you can talk about those kind of things just like it was a day like I'm driving to the bank and this happened, right? You got to get to where you can talk about that kind of stuff just like that easy. Because if it's hard, it means there's already some damage there, right? If it's
Mhm.
hard to talk about that, like in a way that like not in a way that like, hey, maybe this isn't the right environment. Because yeah, you got to be in the right environment to talk about it. But like hard to even get it to come out of your mouth, right? That means there's already some damage that we gotta work through. And the only way out is through. The only way out is through. I am a firm believer of that. And you gotta get it out there. You gotta identify it. And then you just, like I just talked about, blowing people up and things like it, and all the things that those are things that absolutely had impact on me and absolutely were buried for a little while. And had more impact than I even realized, until I really started to talk about these things. And actually writing the book was cathartic. And
Yeah, for sure.
you don't have to write a book. You can just write a journal. You can share those things, right? Um, but there is health in that. But if you don't abbreviate the wound, uh, it'll kill you. It'll kill you from the inside out. And it could be as little as a little nick on your thumb, you know?
Those are the worst ones because you treat the big ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what I said in the book too. I was like, look, a lot of this stuff I was prepared for, it didn't really negatively affect me, but my relationship, that thing freaking knocked me off my feet.
Yeah.
And most people can relate to that kind of stuff. Like, oh, you're saying that was worse than blowing up and getting shot at? Yeah, I am, because I wasn't prepared for it, which tells you that the stuff that you're dealing with is legit, right? Whatever it is, it's legit.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and you also talk about having a powerful support system too, and I think a lot of the times we bought into this idea of, as men, I've talked about it quite often actually, that being this lone wolf is noble. It's the epitome of masculinity. We have guys like, I remember the Marlboro Man when I was growing up and how cool he was, or Clint Eastwood, and then you get into James Bond and Jason Bourne, and these guys are rebels, right? They operate alone. They don't work well with others. They're cool. They're collected. They get the chicks. They save the day, and we all bought into it. We're like, yeah, I guess that's how we do it, and yet it just doesn't work. It does not work. It's a horrible, horrible way for a man to live.
I still do it. I
Yeah,
know all this stuff and I still do it. I think it's a wiring, but you have to be conscious of it. Like what you just said, you're conscious of it. I bet you still do it too, to
of
some
course.
degree, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Right. But being conscious of it's key. And then acknowledging it and be like, oh crap, I'm trying to be, army of one, which I always thought was a funny phrase, right? Army of one.
yeah.
I get it, one in purpose. But if
Right.
you
Sure.
are an army of one is way less powerful than an army of how many, and I mean, synergy is a real thing. Two people equal three, can't equal three. Uh, that's what they say with the mastermind groups too. You got you got two minds working, you got 2.5 mind power, right? It's the same across all spectrums. Like unity of force is much, much more powerful than standing by yourself.
Yeah. Well, Brian, I appreciate the conversation. Let the guys know where to connect with you, learn more about what you're up to, and then obviously pick up a copy of Cleared Hot as well.
Yeah, I'm on all the socials. I'll give you the links. You can put them in here. I think I may have sent them out to you already,
You
but
sent them to me. Yeah, but
yeah.
yeah, share them
So
here.
Yep, all the social links. I'm on so Brian Slade at LinkedIn and Instagram, and clearedhot.info is our website, and you can get the book on Amazon and it's on Audible too now. So and it's me reading it, so be wary.
How was that process for you? Because I've done that on a couple books now. How was that process?
Oh my gosh, man, I have such admiration for people that do that for a living, because it took me 16 tries
Yeah,
to get
it's
it right.
tough.
And even
Yeah.
then I was like, okay, that's good enough. Right. For the first one, I'll tell you, this is kind of funny story. My brother, he's like, you gotta read your own book because nobody else is going to do your story justice and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I don't know, man, I can tell a story, but reading is different. Right. And, and so I did it. And I said, man, I think I'm going to hire somebody because it just sounds retarded, he listens. He's like, no, man, I'm sure it's good. And he listens to it. And he's like, yeah, maybe you should hire somebody. And and then I was like, oh no, no, no. Now I'm doing this,
Now
because
you want to do it.
he threw out the
Sure.
gauntlet, right? And it took me 16 tries. I think it ended up pretty okay.
Pretty okay.
Pretty
There it is,
okay.
guys. Go get
Yeah.
the audiobook. It's pretty okay.
Yeah, I'm a salesperson. So no,
Well,
but
brother,
go
I
check it
appreciate.
out.
We will. We'll sync everything up. I appreciate you and coming on the podcast, and obviously service to the country as well. You have to operate in the ugly, and a lot of us have the luxury of benefiting from the work that guys like you do. So I want to honor you and of course respect you and your work and your service and obviously what you're doing now to help guys find their purpose and mission as they go forward. So I appreciate you, brother. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate you having me.